Very good. We're going to get moving on into our next two presenters, and I think the previous presenters we just saw were about kind of seeing how we're keeping track of the weather issues and the water issues in this state, which then lead to climatic data. And then I think the next two presenters are going to talk a little bit more about how do we use that to make plans and to have useful dialogue with farmers and other people that can use that data. So we're going to move into a talk on scenario planning, and there's going to be two speakers, one of which is Tyler Williams, who you've heard from a couple times already, but I'll repeat a little bit of this. But Tyler's an extension educator here in Nebraska, focused on climate issues, but really focused on climate issues in agriculture, and his background lends to that very well with a background in meteorology and agronomy. Grew up in Nebraska on a ranch. And one of the things he sent in his bio that I liked was that he's trying to reduce the impact of climate on agriculture, but also trying to reduce the impact of agriculture on climate. And so I think that's an interesting kind of back and forth there, because obviously agriculture and the application of nitrogen and other things adds to greenhouse gases, and trying to minimize that and other things. Our other speaker is Tonya Haigh, and Tonya is a rural sociologist with the Drought Mitigation Center, and trying to bring that social perspective to the decision-making process and to decision-making tools, I think is a really critical importance to trying to deal with these issues. And today they're going to talk about scenario planning with ranchers and farmers, and how scenario planning works, but also how it has impacted decision-making in the drought of 2016 in South Dakota. So I think Tyler's going to start for us.
Yeah, you can hear me okay? I talk a little loud, so I'll lower it a little bit. But when I put my name on the agenda, I didn't know I was going to be doing all this other thing. So sorry you have to hear from me more than you care to. But I'll share with you pretty quick a project that we've been working on with South Dakota State, focused on scenario planning. And as we saw in most of the other talks today, there are a number of different scenarios that can happen. And so that's what we wanted to do. And we realized that, especially in the agricultural industry, those scenarios are important. And so focusing on the different scenarios and visiting with agricultural producers, we did this through cropping systems and through beef systems stakeholders, to try to get a handle on what scenarios impact them the most. And so, why scenario planning? Again, because it's a little bit based on uncertainty. And as we know in Nebraska, our weather and what's going to happen next year is certainly uncertain. And so, it's not a forecast. So if you look at the up here on the left, it's not saying this is what was likely to happen and planning for a little deviation off that. It's planning for a large range of possibilities. And so that was kind of the point of this project, is consider what are the most plausible possibilities, what are the most likely scenarios that can happen on a farm or ranch that impact you. So we consider that range of possibilities, but this process is easily adaptable to any operation. So it wasn't just going to be useful to an operation in Harrison, Nebraska. It's useful to one in Wausau. Wherever it might be, you can do this. But it's sort of the planning for the worst and hoping for the best thing, right? We don't want to be doom and gloom and talk about the worst scenarios possible, but if you have a plan for the worst thing that could happen, the things that might happen, or occasionally do happen, might be a little bit better than that. So you're kind of plan for the best or worst and hope for the best. But if we just think about this past year, right? So I'm going to just kind of go through what scenarios impacted agriculture in this 1 year. Of a whole host of years that they've had to deal with, but we started out the season on the left. We had a dust storm warning come across my cell phone. I didn't even know that you could do that, other than I got a warning on my cell phone. At the end of April, we had a dust storm warning. One of the drier Aprils we've had on record was this past year. And as Al just talked about, the trend for Aprils is wetting, right? So we kind of debunked that trend and didn't stay true to the course, right? So we kind of had to plan for that scenario. And then you can see the map on the right. Those are all of the places that had record rainfall so it's not record, but from 1977 to 2017. The dots, the colors, were the number of inches they were higher in 2018 compared to the previous record year in that time frame. So all this is showing you, it's not that they had really high rainfall. It was 9 to 10 to 12 inches above what they'd previously had in the last 50 years. So this was the through the 2018. So they went from dealing with dry to all of a sudden dealing with record rain. We talked about one of the biggest trends we've seen is minimum temperatures, especially summertime minimum temperatures. That's been increasing over time, relatively steady. For producers, that impacts a lot of things. It impacts the animal's ability to recover at night. It needs to cool down at night in order for that animal to recover. Crops continue to respire at night if there's a warmer temperature, so that can reduce some of their energy and ultimately yield. But you can't really see it, but if there's a blue spot in the middle there, actually in July, we have below normal nighttime minimum temperatures. So again, goes away from the trend that we just saw. Another scenario that we can look at and plan for that might be different than what you think. Now, this is just looking at airport data. This is from Lincoln Airport data. So this on the left side is April, right? So in April, we had the top 10 coldest April on record. This is for Lincoln Airport, so it doesn't have a ton of data. But then we had the top 10 warmest May. It just went from cold to hot, just flipped a switch. Then we had a top 10 wettest June and a top 10 driest July. All four of those scenarios require completely different management options and operational systems if you're trying to manage a farm or a ranch or anything. If you're trying to manage a city, so having plans for those different types of scenarios, even though are unlikely in a lot of cases, it happened last year, right? You just didn't, it's hard to plan for that and say, oh yeah, this summer is going to be wet, this summer is going to be dry. If we average all of this, it was an average summer because we went wet and dry, so it's beyond what an average might do. So the scenario of this, right, and we were still harvesting corn in December. It turned wet, it turned cold. Again, debunks the trend a little bit and where we've been in our fall, but planning for that scenario and how you operate in that is a big deal. Just in the last 3 weeks, blizzards, wet calving conditions, and then all these ice chunks, right? There's a whole different set of problems and issues and scenarios that you can deal with as these pops up. So it just kind of leads to the reasoning behind planning for these different scenarios. Because what you plan for this and this and this is different. But when you're going into a season, you don't think that any of those things might happen. So you have to kind of have a plan for if they do. So the goals for our project, just only have a few slides here going to share with you. But our goals were to meet with agricultural producers because believe it or not a lot of people are engaging producers when it comes to climate, right? Probably because a lot of times we like to talk about in 100 years. We'd like to talk about this long average. I just showed you a whole host of things that we can sit down and visit with producers about. And so that's what we did. We shared the science. We shared the same maps that you saw. We shared in those meetings. We shared about, what you might be able to do with your crops. How does your ear of corn change with these changes? How can you change what you're harvesting? Focused on those things. And we listened, right? So we had lots of open discussions, talked a lot about weather. Believe it or not, there's a lot of weather history out there from a lot of people. And so we wanted to discover, what impacts their operations the most. What I think impacts the operation might be different than what actually impacts their operations. So that's a big thing we wanted to get, was to hear it from them. If I think that extreme temperatures in the summer are a big deal, but they're like, nah, it's not that big a deal, maybe that's not something that we can focus all of our efforts on. And then we wanted to find a need, right? So thinking from an extension perspective, how can we help people deal with that and utilize this system? So our process was to gather a diverse group. We didn't go just get producers. We brought NRCS people, we brought businessmen, we brought feedlot owners, we brought cattle buyers, the whole host of the agricultural system who had a role in that, and brought them all together. We updated on the science, like I talked about that, and then we had those open discussions, which I think was probably the biggest part. And then now we're just creating a response, creating what can we do to help. And so our first product, I guess, from that, I'll share with you. I thought it was after the slide. I'll share with you in a minute. You can hold out in the product part. So some of the outcomes that we came from that, we realized that ag has experienced a lot over time. A lot of those scenarios that we can talk about, they can refer back to years, and they remember the exact year of that happening before or something similar. They can recall on those experiences and say what worked to get them through that, what didn't work. And so we tried capturing that of what did you do in the past that did or did not work that might get you through it happening again. The extremes, and we talked a lot about the combination of extremes is what really gets them. This last event, this flooding event, was extreme, but it's the combination of the extreme cold that we had before it and really frozen ground, a combination of all of the snow that was sitting on top of the ground that had been there for 3 weeks. So the combination of extremes, when those things align, that's where they see the biggest problems and the impacts on their operation. The ag decisions are complex. One guy was telling a story that he was getting heckled for tearing out his tree line, right? Because there's a lot of people will see a tree line go and say, oh, you're going to tear that tree line out and farm it. Well, what had happened is that it was now being assessed as cropland and no longer as non-cropland. And as anyone that pays taxes on cropland knows that cropland is assessed at a much higher value and taxes are a lot higher. So they were going to farm it since it was going to be assessed as farmland, as a farmland product. So anyway, so it wasn't just that they took the tree line out, it was a whole set of scenarios that sort of led up to that. So there was always interesting discussions to have. But one big thing that we talked about is they have to be farming in 2 years in order to be farming in 50 years. Because a lot of people will say, well, if they want to keep their farm around, they should plan further out. And they come back and say, well, if the bank takes it in 2 years, I'm not much use on that land in 50. So the economics plays a big role in continuing that farming and focusing on being able to make it through the next 2. And there are a number of practices and things that work in multiple scenarios. And no-till is an example of that. They talk how that works when it's too dry and it works when it's too wet, as far as firming up that ground and able to get in there in that field a little bit earlier. So there are a number of things that they talked about that help in a number of those scenarios. And those are the things that we focus on when it comes to this, right? So these are the products that I showed you, told you about. This is just some interactive graphics based all off the products and the scenarios that they told us impacted their operations. What does a farm look like in a wet and cold spring? What does that farm look like? What are the impacts? And then we wanted to make that connection to a number of the extension and university resources that are out there to help answer all those questions. We can imagine what a wet, cold spring looks like outside, right? It's actually spring today, so that's interesting. But anyway, so the idea is to get a picture and help plan ahead for those possible scenarios. So when this does happen, they're not caught off guard. They've got a plan and they've thought about this. So that's pretty much it. That's 2 years of a project wrapped up in 10 minutes. I'm going to turn it over to Tonya because she has a similar but different project that will go more into the scenario planning. So I'm going to just give this to you.
Then we'll do questions at the end if we have time.
Yep, and I'll pull up your PowerPoint if you like.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. It's really, really a great honor for me to be here with you all today and having this discussion. I think at this point, Tyler and I have started to try to move the discussion from, okay, here's all this climate information. What can we do about it? What can we do to prepare ourselves for this? And I work as a social scientist, and so that's, the people end is a lot of what I deal with. I work again with the National Drought Mitigation Center. Our center is based here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and we work with drought planning at a really broad, everything from the national level down to the counties, states, communities. I work specifically mostly with farmers and ranchers, and that's what I'm going to be focused on today, but I think the concepts, the ideas really are transferable or are across, and I'm happy to talk with you about any of those levels of planning. So I want to talk about why do we encourage drought planning? Why do we encourage planning for climate extremes? And I'll start with, whoops, where'd it go? Tyler, I lost something. Bring me back. Okay, while you're doing that, there it's back. I won't do that again. Why plan? Stuff's gonna happen. We're gonna have floods, we're gonna have droughts. What good does this do us to plan for it? This is commonly used in hazards management. Right now with this flood, this is where we're at right now. We had the disaster. We're assessing our impacts. We're trying to respond to the disaster. We're going to be going through a long recovery and reconstruction phase. This obviously is devastating, has a lot of impacts, is going to be a difficult process. The whole idea of planning is what are the things we can do before a disaster, not that's going to make the disaster not happen, but that can lessen the impacts and that can make response, recovery, reconstruction an easier and more effective process. Oop. Oh, there we go. Question of what can you actually plan for, I think, is an interesting one with climate change. So who recognizes this quote and can tell me who said it? Anyone? Go ahead, holler it out if you know. Right. So we're not going to talk about that context, but what he said was actually pretty valuable in the context of climate change and planning for climate extremes. So there are known knowns. Those are really easy to plan for, right? Like I know it's going to rain in the spring and I buy a raincoat and I buy an umbrella. I'm good to go. You plan for that, right? There are known unknowns. I know, I live in Nebraska. I know there's going to be a drought at some point. I don't know when. It's unknown, but I know it's going to happen. And then with climate change, we're really getting into this area of unknown unknowns. How are things going to change that we haven't experienced before and that we don't exactly know how? Well, it's possible. It's easiest to plan, obviously, for the known knowns. We do that every day. It's possible to plan for the known unknowns, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. It's also possible somewhat to plan for the unknown unknowns. And that's really what the scenario planning approach that Tyler was talking about is really valuable in trying to start thinking about how do we plan for the unknown unknowns. So I work mostly, again, with farmers and ranchers, and we have some resources on the NDMC website for drought planning mostly for rangeland managers, actually. It's at drought.unl.edu/ranchplan. And these materials were developed working with rangeland advisors and experts, but also really a number of rangeland managers across the Great Plains, from South Dakota down to Kansas, over to Colorado, who told us their stories, who told us about how they plan for drought. And we really built these resources around them. And this is what they told us that they do. These are the most important things that they do. They mitigate, they think about how to respond, and they think about their recovery. So they said, first of all, we make sure we are increasing the health of our overall operations and maximizing our flexibility between and during droughts. That's key. But at the same time, we are making a plan for when drought happens, and we're going to have to respond to it because we know it's going to happen. So I've got a plan. I know what to do and when drought starts to occur. And when drought occurs, I do it. And then I have a plan for how I recover afterwards. So there are different aspects to their plans. And I'm going to focus mostly on the effect of the drought response plan today. And that's, again, the drought response plan is this idea that when you start to notice that it's becoming dry or that you're going to have a forage deficiency, that you're starting to think and that you're starting to actually take appropriate action. You're not waiting until extreme drought is already taking place. The reason that this process really helps for a more efficient and a more effective drought response or any kind of hazard response is really understood if you get into some of the social science of hazard response. And I think a lot of us have experienced this actually with the flooding of the last week. With any hazard, it's not an immediate process. I see it, I've responded. Like, it doesn't really happen quite like that. There are a number of steps that we go through individually, psychologically, but also as a society. It takes time to recognize that a hazard is occurring. It takes time to really perceive that hazard as something that's a threat to me. It takes time for me to think, okay, well, yeah, there's this flooding going on, but am I in danger, or are some other people who are at lower levels in danger? All of this takes time. And then I get to the point that I say, oh, I am in danger. What am I going to do? And then it takes time to think through all those options. If we're talking about a fire, you might be thinking about which exit should I go out. If you're thinking about a flood, you might be thinking about, how do I get water out of the basement, or how do I move animals? If you're thinking about a drought, you might be thinking long term, like, well, should I be selling animals now? Should I be buying hay? Like, what should I be doing? That takes time. And then it takes time to actually carry out the response. And at each of these steps in hazard response, there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of uncertainty, and you have to think through all of this stuff, and your hazard's happening and you're a little bit panicky and you don't really know what to do. And it's not really the best way to try to get through hazard response. It's probably the least pleasant way, and it's probably the least effective way. So what we hope is, and you can't see this at all, but what we hope is that the steps in having a drought plan actually help to lessen some of these sources of uncertainty up here and shorten and make more efficient these steps of responding to drought. So I'm going to try not to speak too long, but so we want to know, what effect does it actually have to have a drought plan? What effect does it have for rangeland managers? We did a survey after the 2016 drought in South Dakota, which is probably a drought. It was a short-term flash drought, not necessarily a dry winter, but extremely warm June without precipitation, and the drought just blew up. Something that we may see more of in this region, or at least in that region. The purple dots are the folks who we surveyed. The 2016 drought, they told us, led to harm in pasture hay yield reductions, range productivity reductions, range health or diversity, net income of their operation, cash reserves or savings. They experienced either moderate or extremely harmful conditions during that drought. And then we asked these folks, do you have a plan for drought? Do you have a plan of what do you do when you start to notice drought occurring? About 2/3 said they did, about 1/3 said they didn't. And then we tried to find out, well, what difference does it make? Well, one thing that we found really was a big difference was folks who had a drought plan started destocking their pastures much earlier than folks who did not have a drought plan. And so this bar is percent that destocked. If they had to destock at all, did they destock in July or earlier, or did they wait until later in the season? So if they had a drought plan, they destocked much earlier. Well, the effect of that not only was that they saw less harm to their rangeland health and diversity, but they also saw, because in 2016, livestock prices were generally on the decline. They also saw that they didn't have as much harm to their net income in 2016. And so this is folks who, yes, have a drought plan. This is folks who don't have a drought plan. The light blue is moderately harmful. The dark blue is extremely harmful. So you can see it wasn't that they were saying we didn't experience any harm, the drought was no problem, I had a drought plan, no problem. But it moved a number of them into experiencing moderate harm versus extreme harm. And getting through some of the hazards that we have lived through here because we live in Nebraska, and that we may see in different ways, is really about trying to stay at a level of harm that we can manage, that's within sort of our area of resiliency. And this is where we're seeing an effect that having a drought plan may be helpful. So I'm hoping that's a really great sales pitch for why we shall be thinking about planning, not only for drought, but for all other climate extremes. Again, this is the website where you can find more information about the Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch site. We do have a number of professional development resources. There's a handbook that you can download. There are some videos of webinars and other resources that you can download to use as for your own training or with groups of people. We would welcome any feedback, any thoughts on improving the site. And just a quick nod to our partners and some contact information. We'd be happy to follow up with any of you about any of this. So I'm hoping I didn't go too much over my time. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions for, I'm going to pass out the mic here.
I have two questions. First, Tyler, can you say the location of your report that you were talking about?
Yeah, thanks. Forgot that.
Okay.
At weather-ready.unl.edu is where we have a lot of those resources. So yeah, weather-ready.unl.edu.
Thank you. And then Tonya, can you comment on was there any trend in the farmers or the ranchers that had the drought plan versus not, in terms of like geographic location or size of farm, or anything? Was it pretty well distributed?
That's a great question. This survey was limited in geographic area there was sort of a bullseye in western South Dakota. And so that's really where a lot of our respondents were from There were differences in, I actually did look at this. I want to say more resources, slightly larger operations being more likely to have drought plans at this point. There weren't a lot of geographic differences. I think there may be between states some geographic differences. The South Dakota Grazing Lands or Grasslands Coalition has been a really strong advocate of rangeland drought planning, and they've done a lot of education in South Dakota. So they're, the 2/3 versus 1/3 may not be something that would hold true for other states across the Great Plains.
Tonya? Before I ask my question, I want to make a plug. The National Drought Mitigation Center was a huge partner in the development of our drought plan at the North Platte NRD, and they were terrific, and they were inexpensive, and maybe their price has gone up, but you were great. My question is sort of related to the one that was just asked. In many instances, in order to qualify for certain farm programs, either through NRCS or FSA, you have to have a conservation plan in place at the NRCS office. Has there been any discussion with any of your partners about requiring a drought plan at a micro level for a landowner in order to participate in programs?
That's a great question. I think that's, again, South Dakota, NRCS, I believe, I don't know if they still have the policy, but there was a policy on the books, and this is something that I think that the state NRCS boards can make these decisions. South Dakota for a while had a requirement for receiving EQIP funding that you needed to have a drought plan for your operation. So they did try to have that kind of a tie. I don't know how much that's been done in other states, honestly.
In your planning process, those you're talking about, you didn't really address urban, and you're a sociologist.
Right.
And one of the biggest things that divides our state is the urban-rural divide. And then when you get into water and water usage in urban, why didn't you include urban more? Because we're all a rural state.
Right.
And when you talk of your planning, that's a key component of us keeping us all happy campers and living together and being happy Nebraskans.
Absolutely.
So
the NDMC as an organization actually does address planning at the community level for urban areas as well as rural areas, for counties, for the NRD level, as you said, for for the entire watershed, which is probably the best place to try to merge those needs and those concerns between rural and urban is by looking at a watershed plan, as well as being strongly involved in state level planning and national. And I'd be happy to point you to those. We have other resources that are more at those levels, because obviously when you get past, at the ranch level, your decision making pretty much all takes place within a family or a small group. When you start to move into communities and watersheds, a huge part of planning is really just getting people to the table and starting to understand across needs and thinking about compromise and running scenarios that that might help you see the trade-offs. So planning is critical and much more complex when you get beyond the level of agriculture. So yeah, I'd be happy to, if you go to just our website actually and look under planning, you'll find the resources for a lot of different levels of planning.
The hazard mitigation planning that you all are doing related to drought is really impressive, but I'm wondering if there are other agencies or if the university is also doing hazard mitigation related to extreme precipitation, like we've seen here, or related to soil erosion for ag producers or other issues.
I know the scenario planning project, Tyler can speak to, really looked at a range of climate extremes.
Yeah, so one instance is where we're putting together a project we're calling Weather Ready Farms, and focuses on the breadth of weather that you could get. A big portion of that is on extreme rainfall events, because those are devastating, especially on cropland, and erosion and things like that. So it's sort of a comprehensive program that goes all the way from water conservation to keeping your land when you get rainfall events like that. So I'm sure there are probably other things, but that's just one thing that we're working on, and hopefully we'll have rolling soon.
Any last questions? Well, let's thank Tyler and Tonya.